You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Just Japan podcast, the podcast all about Japan and everything Japan. So my name is Kevin O'Shea, and I am the host of this podcast, and I want to welcome you to episode number 209. And in this week's episode, we're talking about university jobs in Japan. Each week, we like to have different topics, cover a broad range of things, and this is actually a topic that we covered many years ago. Now, of course, as you know, the Just Japan podcast did take quite a long hiatus from having new episodes, many years, in fact. But now we're back, and this topic was first covered in episode number 27. Now, this week, I'm going to be talking to my good friend, PJ, known online as Kansai PJ. And he is a university instructor, and he's based in Osaka, Japan. And he joined me back on August 12th of 2014 for episode number 27 of the Just Japan podcast, where he talked about his kind of story, his origin story in Japan, and what it's like to get a job teaching at a university, how one does that. So fast forward, we sat down and had a conversation in 2023 for the Just Asia podcast. And we talked all about many of the similar topics, but obviously with all of those years in between interviews, things have evolved, things have changed. Now, for many of you out there who want to go to Japan, this may be an option, teaching in universities. And PJ is going to give you some advice. He's going to explain his story, how he got working in universities in Japan, and what people out there, what kind of a little bit also snippets of life, what it's like to teach in universities. And of course, what you might be able to do in order to get a position working at a university or part-time at various universities in Japan. So again, this is episode number 209. We're back to talking about university jobs in Japan, and it's a fascinating topic. It's something that I personally have never done. I've been an educator for many years, but I've never worked teaching adults in Japan. Yeah, it's great stuff. Now, before we jump into the interview, I just want to thank all of you amazing listeners for taking the time to, out of your day, your evening, your afternoon, to download the Just Japan podcast, to listen, to support the podcast. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed the last episode with Tony Vega, about his incredible journey walking the Tokaido Road. It was a fantastic interview. I really enjoyed listening to it myself. I hope you did as well. You definitely will get something out of this episode. And so sit back and listen to my conversation, an updated conversation with PJ, all about working in Japan. Again, the first one was all the way back in 2014. And we got to sit down last year in 2023 and chat more about this. And guys, I know a lot of you really used to love having PJ on as a regular guest on the Just Japan podcast. So I definitely will be talking to him about coming on for future episodes, just even episodes where we talk about current affairs in Japan and shoot the breeze, because those were always some of the most popular episodes of the Just Japan podcast. All right, so there we go. Sit back and enjoy my conversation with PJ. As I would with any guest, I'm going to start off by asking you to introduce yourself, to tell the people out there a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you found yourself in Japan.
Well, I first met you when we were in lockup. I believe it was in... No, I'm just kidding.
It was a minimum security prison.
Minimum security. It's
minimum people. It was okay. White collar crime. Victim.
I've been in Japan, a long time. It's hard to really date it because I've lived here 3 times. Mm-hmm. I lived here as a sister city teacher for a few years. And then I started the JET program, which I didn't finish because my father passed, and I returned again. And then I finally came back. Everybody, all my foreign friends here all know exactly the day they arrived, and they have like a birthday to celebrate their time in Japan. I genuinely don't know exactly when I came. It was either 98 or 99. and I don't know what time of year it was.
Okay.
I'm not very good with the memory. Or rather, I have the memories, but they're unstuck in time, and I don't, they don't mean anything one to the other. I met you, I think, from YouTube back in our YouTube days, right?
I would have met you in person back in 2008. So you were.
Oh,
Yeah, 2008. I met you my first year in Japan. I don't have so for all of you guys out there listening, you may find the vibe of this interview a little bit different maybe than other interviews because PJ and I know each other quite well. So you'll maybe find that rapport is a little bit different. A lot of other guests I may be talking to for the first time ever, or just maybe I've talked to them for we met. I met PJ through YouTube actually, and that would have been the early days of the kind of Japan vlogging scene. Pre-monetization, no one made money. People just did it for fun, and there was a real social element to it. So a lot of us content creators would get together and meet up in person. And I do remember that my wife was quite nervous the first time I was going to go meet you. And there was also
did she think I was dangerous?
Well, I mean, the whole concept of meeting people that are from online, right? Or meeting people who you watch their videos in 2008, that was definitely something that was pretty new. But I met you, and I think her name was I want to say Kristen.
Well, yeah, it's Chris, but Chris, I forget what her online name was at the time.
It was like KKA Japan or something like that.
Something
like that. But she was another. So the three of us met, and then we ended up collaborating a lot in person. You and I back in the day. Because right now, as we do this interview on Zoom, we have this luxury, but we didn't have that at the time. So when we wanted to do some kind of collaboration video, we'd actually have to meet in person. Heaven forbid. I like you don't actually remember the date I arrived in Japan. It was quite a bit after you, I suppose, but I remember it was around Golden Weekish time. So I think weekish. But yeah, okay. So you've been in Japan for a while, and you've had a variety of jobs. They've all been in education. But like you said, you came in a Sister Cities program, which is something that doesn't exist anymore, does it?
Oh, it does.
Oh, it does. Okay. So
many cities don't do it anymore.
Okay.
But again, naturally, that would be done at the city or prefectural level, and basically, it's an adjunct to or not adjunct. That's not the word, but it's a supplement to the JET program. JET's, it's like Japan Exchange, whatever the T stands for.
Teachers,
Toodaloo.
Japan Exchange for
Oh, that's it. Not Toodaloo. Where was that?
Japan Exchange, Toodaloo.
So a lot of cities don't get enough teachers that way. So where they can, some prefectures supplement with sister city teachers. And I was brought over as part of that. Technically, at the time, I didn't live in the city that Himeji, which was my first city in Japan. They were sister cities with Phoenix, Arizona. And I didn't even live in Phoenix, but they couldn't find anyone to go. Okay. And I did live in northern Arizona in Flagstaff, and I had studied Japanese history. So they thought, somebody said, why don't you give it a shot? And eventually they did end up getting two other teachers, and the three of us went over. It was the beginning of a love affair, a love-hate relationship with Japan. But it's been my home on and off most of my adult life. So since, what was that? That was in summer of 92.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. So that was a way back. And then, but again, interspersed with those three times to live here. Oh, my English is hard for me. Interspersed with those, there were several years back in the States between the first and the second and the third. But then since the 98 or 99, whenever it was, I've been here. I just decided, it wasn't worth coming back again. I was going to stick it out until I was really done. And though I say that may come at any moment, it has not yet happened.
So, I mean, I asked you to come on the podcast for this episode because I wanted to readdress to cover a topic that we covered some years ago on the Just Japan podcast, and this was Just Japan podcast episode 27 called University Jobs, which we recorded in August of 2014.
Wow. And I was in this same room, and
Yeah.
sadly, it was cleaner and in much better shape. The falling down around me. But yes, I remember that very talk.
Yeah, so I mean, and to be honest, it was one of the most downloaded episodes of the Just Japan podcast, which is very cool. I can say that I think in download wise, it's in the tens of thousands of downloads, that one episode. Yeah. Right? Like it's like more than 20,000, I think close to 30,000 downloads that one episode, which is wild. And hey, I'm not expecting to catch lightning twice here, but I mean it's a fascinating topic and people are very interested in it. So what led you kind of what's the path that you went from being an assistant language teacher, say as in the Sister City program or in the JET program, and to going to work at a university, that obviously has a different set of skills and this and that. How did you find yourself making that transition?
Slowly, reluctantly, and ass backwards. If one can we say that ass?
Yeah, absolutely. You can say ass backwards.
I was as you know, a lot of JETs and the assistant language teachers in junior and senior high school are probably not qualified teachers. They come over and the point is that originally they wanted just to have people come. It was a way for Japan to experience foreigners and equally for foreigners to experience Japan. The foreign ministry paid for back then anyway, half of the program. So they considered it basically a cultural exchange. And it just, I did that and I fell in love with teaching. I was fortunate that my city, Himeji, most of the teachers that came from Australia and Arizona were actual professional licensed teachers.
Okay.
And so I got a front row seat to how to do it. I was encouraged by people who, rather than be elitist and kind of just blow me off, were actually quite helpful and instructive without being full of themselves. And I learned a lot from a lot of good teachers, Australian and American and Japanese, frankly. And I just felt that I liked it. But my previous dream was to get a PhD in Japanese history. And I was really here just to learn Japanese, to make money, and to improve my CV, my resume. So that I had continued to apply to graduate schools back in the U.S. I got into a good one, University of Michigan. And so I went. Okay. And then found I just did not like academia, particularly history. Okay. It was a great school. I'm not knocking the school at all. I loved it there. But it wasn't for me. And so I came back here under the JET program, figuring I could reignite the glory years of Himeji. I even picked a city that was adjacent to Himeji called Takasago, because it was the closest place I could get and guarantee a spot. I didn't want to be placed somewhere else. I wanted to go back where I had roots already in the community. Okay, yeah. And so when I went back, I resumed ALT work, and I would have stayed all 3 years, except for my father passed, and I thought it was time to go back after the first year, or was it second? I think it was first year. And anyway, when I went back to the States, got into a relationship. Well, actually, I got into a relationship before, but it reignited, and it was rather serious. So I followed him out to California. And I just decided while I was there, I missed Japan so much that I would take the UC Davis had a TESOL certification course. And originally I did K through 12, and then I did adult. And then while I was there, I got my teacher substitute license and things like that. But we had both had the opportunity to come back to Japan. So that's when we did. And again, 98, 99, whenever it was. Now that relationship did not last, but I've been in Japan ever since. And when I came back, I started working as a ALT again, but quickly moved into teaching at an international high school. I didn't have the American teaching license, but I had the substitute license and the TESOL certification. And in a pinch, they needed somebody, so it got me in the door. I loved it, and eventually I came to be coordinator of the English program within the school. And that kind of level of admin work, although, again, wasn't really trusted with anything real, but just the illusion of admin and leadership, I became interested in going back to school, and I got my master's in TESOL with the idea that I could parlay that into work either continuing on in K through 12 or university. And eventually I just went university. The pay is better. I would argue you're less of a teacher than you would be at the K through 12 level, but the money and the respect were better. And so I did that. And I eventually went on to a PhD, which I've never finished. I started it with good intent and went through the coursework and got all the way to working on my dissertation itself, and then life got in the way. I may go back at some time, but honestly, I'm enjoying life minus the
dissertation.
Yeah, and just academics and research and publishing.
Well, it's interesting. In the last a few things I've been thinking of, like while we've been talking about this, how you had mentioned before we started recording that you listened to the episode with Casey Bean, who lives in Ishikawa, and actually he has a master's in TESOL. That's what he got, which brought him to where he is now. And he met his partner in America, and now he works at a university there, and I should say in Ishikawa. But I was thinking about my own father and his journey, just because my son Kai, who of course you know very well, Kai recently wrote a biography of his grandpa for a humanities class. And the one thing that Kai really learned about was how my father had he finished his master's in cultural anthropology and was working on his PhD, and he made it all the way to his dissertation, and then he decided to scrap it at that point. And he went to work for the government of Canada and Parks Canada, because he realized that once he finished his dissertation and this and that, it would basically have pigeonholed him at that time into academia only, into working at a university. And he just didn't want to do that. He didn't want to teach. He wanted to be and for him, he wanted to be in the field, working with people, researching kind of in the real world, as opposed to in a school. So that wasn't for him. So he actually... My father did the same thing. He stopped his PhD right at that dissertation, and then he also never picked it back. Well, he never picked it back up. It just wasn't something for him.
The difference is your father did it conscientiously, and I slid into it again, ass backwards. I'm less the planner and the conscientious mover. I did like research. I hated the politics of publishing and research, but the actual study and the write-ups I enjoyed. I do miss that. I may go back someday. By the way, I'd love to read Kai's if he would be okay with that.
Yeah, I'm sure he would be more than happy to. I'll have him send it to you. Now I'm curious. One of the things that I know, because I know you well, and I've met other people in Japan who work in universities, and I've heard people who work in universities talk about their careers and the kind of the work life they have and this and that. You work part-time at several schools, and a lot of people I've met who work in, say, the Kansai region of Japan, who work in universities, are in the same situation, whereas then they work at several different schools as opposed to maybe working just at one, which is kind of traditionally, when you think about university work, you do think of someone just being employed at one school. Why is that the case where you are? Why are so many professors or instructors part-time at many places?
Well, actually, I would now say it's almost global.
Okay.
When we went to university, part-timers were rare, and usually specialists brought in, like you need a Russian language teacher, or they need a particular programmer, right? So you bring those people in. Nowadays, I would say, depending on the field and the university throughout the world, a large percentage of
Oh,
employees
really?
will be part-timers, just
Uh,
because schools are cheap. Um, and they think it's cheaper to have part-timers. I question whether that is true, but that is the prevailing logic. In a lot of countries, you probably can't make a good living at it, and so most people use it as a stepping stone for permanent work, permanent employment, whether it be contracted like an adjunct position or a tenure track type thing. But we're in Japan, you can still make a living at it. I would argue increasingly less so. And for those
okay.
out there considering this path, I would think hard because it is harder and harder. We work more and more for less and less money. I mean, I'm still as I see you sit here sipping whiskey. I'm not I'm not at any stretch. I'm not poor by any stretch, but I would say, and I've talked recently. I was talking to a friend whose kid is studying TESOL
Okay.
back in the U.S., and she wanted to know what it was like teaching here. And I said, you really gotta wonder if this is the path, because some countries, yeah, you can make a good salary at. Japan, less and less so. It's just kind of what's happening in Japan generally. As you know, salaries have been stagnant for the last 30
Yep.
years, give or take rare exceptions. I do get raises from time to time, but it's a very rare thing here. But anyway, in Japan, in the Japanese context, in English, I should say specifically, you have three kinds of jobs. The tenure track or tenured positions, uh, the adjunct contract full timers, and they can be here from 1 to 3 to 5 years. But there's usually a limitation, and that's why so many people you've met, myself included, chose the part time route because most schools don't have limitations on part time work.
Oh, okay. I because I've heard
Although
about.
the
I've
law
heard that.
has changed, the law has changed. So now, after 5/10 years, you're kind of being forced out or forced up. But
Oh,
that's kind of a complicated. It was a law that was put into place to kind of stop contract work and encourage companies to hire Shying or company employees instead of temporary contract workers. It's actually backfired, and many schools and companies use it as an excuse to can someone at the 5th year mark or 10-year mark. It depends. In education, we can go up to 10 years, but most fields it's 5 years, and then they have to offer you an uncontracted permanent position, even if it's a part-time permanent position.
okay.
Now, I'm very fortunate that one of the universities I work at is very open-minded about this thing, and they don't mind it. They realize why not. There's actually no benefit to the employee, but a lot of universities are afraid. So recently, there has been term limits on part-time work. But again, one of the three there isn't, and the other two are taking a squeamish gray zone approach.
Okay.
But in any case, I'm lucky that I on all three of my positions, I don't have term limits. And that's why a lot of people do the permanent, they call it, technically you're a part-time adjunct,
Okay.
meaning you're hired, contracted year to year, and your job is to do a special function not provided by the department that hired you normally. And in my case, it would be an English instructor. So
Mhm.
I teach, depending on, again, three different schools, but mostly engineers, architects, science majors. I've taught other majors in the past, but that's right now where I've ended up. And like I said, I do make a living at it, a decent living, but it is harder and harder. A lot of my friends have either moved up to full-time work. And again, there are pluses and minuses. They get paid less per hour than I do, but by the time you include their benefits and their research funds and other funds that come with the job, it's probably a better package. But it's limited again in terms. It's usually up to 5 years or up to 10, depending on the university.
Okay.
And then again, if you're on the tenure track and you're on that role, you've got a limited time then to get tenure. And if you do, then you're good. You're going to be there ostensibly until you retire. I mean, a lot of people, find other jobs, but they don't have to. They're secure. A mutual friend of ours got tenure this last year, and he can stay until he retires. He probably won't. At some point, he might move on. But it is the upper tier of teaching English at university. Much higher pay and much better benefits.
Yeah, like it seems to me, like in all the years I was, in Japan, that for a lot of people who, I guess, the more motivated ALTs, for example, maybe people who are or people who worked in language schools who wanted to do better. There was a lot of people who were like, I don't want to be a teacher. I don't want this kind of existence. And when you mentioned that like salaries haven't increased in 30 years or so, that's nothing more evident than in the English language field, right? Like you see language teachers who work at public schools are making the same that they would have made in the 1990s. The salaries haven't gone up. So I know a lot of people aspire to get a master's degree so they could work at a university. One thing I do, just anecdotally, I've noticed, and in the last few years, is that you've mentioned a lot more how you seem to have a lot more work going on than before. But I kind of just touching back on what you were saying with the kind of salaries haven't changed in such a long time. For those out there listening who know more about my story, which I kind of talked about in the initial episodes of this podcast, I'm an international school teacher, and I was in Japan for 10 years. But the reason why my family and I decided to leave was for professional reasons, because simply I can make a lot more money when I'm not teaching in Japan. And I have how shall I say, a heavy heart, as I miss Japan so much and I want to go back to Japan. I personally want to return to Japan, but I was in the job recruitment cycle just last fall, and it was just another really challenging year for so many different reasons. But one of the things when I looked at a lot of the schools in Japan that really disappointed me personally was a lot of the top tier schools, the tier 1 schools, international schools in Japan. When you look at their package and you kind of deconstruct it and look at the taxes and look at the health insurance and look at the way they deal with the package in general, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to in a lot of other countries. You actually, I would go from living a pretty darn comfortable existence with my family to basically living paycheck to paycheck again, which is the reason why I left Japan, was because I was working at an international school teacher. I'm a licensed teacher with lots of experience, but I was basically living paycheck to paycheck, not saving anything. Just once the bills were paid. And you remember in those days, I had no money. I never had spending money. So I can see it being challenging. Now, obviously in the last few years with COVID, everything was a shit show in general. So, I don't need to dwell too much on it, because I think a lot of people around the world probably experienced something similar. But how did teaching at a university or universities in Japan, how did that job change for you?
Well, I got to say, I was pretty lucky. I've heard a lot of horror stories around the world, in Japan and beyond. But I was quite lucky. I had 3 relatively forward-thinking universities, and in part because college, I think, it was a great spot to be in for COVID. Young kids need socialization. They need to be around each other. University, although kids want to get together and partay, which is a college right, passage, we didn't, strictly speaking, need it. So most of our schools, we went online. I taught from home, and that's where we got into Zoom, which we're using right now. And all other things like Flipgrid and learn classroom management systems like Google Classroom or Moodle or whatever. I was lucky. I had one of my three schools. The other two schools said, just learn. Bye and good luck. And here we go. This one school paid a lot of money for myself and other teachers to get training and to get the proper licenses to run the equipment. So I actually didn't mind it. I mean, compared to a lot of people, I was okay. I was comfortable at home. But I'm single, as you know, and I know it's shocking for people. How can this man be single? Nonetheless, I am, and COVID was hard when you're a single person in a foreign country. I mean, I do have roots. I have Japanese friends, but those roots are shallow relative to, family and longtime friends. And COVID was hard on a personal level, just because there was, it was this room. I mean, I live in a 2-room apartment, but it's really, you've been here. It's very small.
Yeah.
And that was my world for a lot. You and I got into a location game called Munzie that we still play. Yeah. And that was in many ways a lifesaver because it got me out doing things in a relatively safe manner because we could be outside and, fresh air and what have you. But on the teaching side, it was relatively easy. I had a lot of other people here, frightening stories, hybrid classrooms where they've got some students in the room, some students at home. The teacher could be in one or both or a third place. A hybrid is the worst case scenario for online teaching. It was atrocious. I only had to do hybrid classes at one university for one semester. Otherwise, it was all online and students were online. And from an educational perspective, it was wonderful because the students suddenly were isolated, and I was the master of that classroom in a way that I hadn't been in a long time because they can't talk to each other, they can't dawdle, they can't. Even the groups, when we breakout rooms and such, I could control who was where. Yeah. I loved it. I mean, I know the students found it very difficult, socialization, and especially in Japan, it's the time to join clubs and circles and do arubaito or part-time work. They couldn't do any of that. And you could tell when they came back to school 3 years later, their social skills were horrible.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, now correct me if I'm wrong, but in Japan, like, okay, when we look at America, where you're from, or Canada, where I'm from, when you're in high school, that's the time when people start dating. That's the time where we get our part-time jobs and our summer jobs, and that's where we're working at the 7-Eleven or McDonald's or wherever it may be, and learning about responsibility and how to make money. And that's why we're going through that social thing. We're going to high school dances, or we're going out on dates and this and that, hanging out with groups of friends, causing trouble. But in a lot of Japanese high schools, right, aren't the students so focused often on the studying, that trying to get to university, that they don't have that opportunity? It's kind of postponed until university, right? And then
a lot of the social things, yes. I mean, a lot of them have part-time jobs, but it's very limited. And like you said, the social things, the dating and proms and dances and they are it's not that it doesn't happen, because it does, but it's certainly a very minor aspect of their lives. And the idea is that in Japan, it's college where they've got 4 years to play around and goof off and not be so serious. And ironically, if you've taught Japanese high school students, they seem so mature and put together. And then you see them a year or two later in college and they're 10 again, because they really devolve, and they do. And they're in circles and club activities and part-time jobs and they're having a lot of fun, and they couldn't during COVID. But last 2 years we've been back. And so, it's almost back to the way it was. Not quite. In many ways, it's better now, because this will shock a lot of listeners, but Japan has never been one for high technology on the consumer level. Businesses are different, research is different, but consumer technology is always a bit behind in Japan, including education. And COVID forced us to learn all these things. So now we're back in the classroom, yes, but we're still using learning management systems like Moodle or Google. You know, almost every classroom now finally has projectors and computer stands and Wi-Fi. Like, for example, and I won't mention the name of the university, but at the beginning of COVID, they had a problem. They didn't have the the bandwidth capacity to handle half the students on campus at any one time, which is quite shocking. Wait a minute, what? Well, that's because so few people were online before COVID consistently. You'd have some forefront, teachers that were using internet services, but most of us did not. I used multimedia, Blu-ray, DVD, but I learned long before COVID not to trust the internet, because most services, you'd get a classroom that has no computer hookup, or the projector is from 1970 and won't work with a modern computer. Yeah. A lot of stuff like that. Whereas it forced the universities to implement all the way down. I don't have a room that I don't have HDMI or even VGA or the choice hookups, projectors, power. There's Wi-Fi so that every single person on campus.
So the school's really modernized because of this.
The technical infrastructure had to come up to speed in those 2 or 3 years that
that's a great advantage for you, as someone who likes to use technology. And I mean, it's very interesting for those who are listening who are probably like, what? I mean, me as an international school teacher back in 2015, 16, when I was teaching primary school at an international school in Japan, we were a Google school, and all the kids were using Google Classroom on their one-to-one iPads in grade 2. But that was a different world, those international schools.
Yeah, international is very different. And I also think a lot of international schools necessarily weren't doing that. You guys were.
Yeah.
But and we didn't have that. We didn't know how to use it. It took, and COVID was trial by fire. Some teachers didn't make it. I know a lot of people who quit the profession because they couldn't adapt. Now, as a part-timer, it's actually worked out very well because my laptop is my mobile office. So, though I often have a desk at these universities, it's inconsistent. So I need to be able to bring everything with me, and having a computer that I can plug in when I walk into a classroom. And most of my schools are either using Moodle or Google Classroom. Both have their issues, but they're there, and I don't have to be searching for what is or is not available to students. In the old days, if a student was absent, they couldn't do the work. And so they'd be absent for 3 weeks and come back and go, "Excuse me, Sensei, I've been absent for 3 weeks. I'm not prepared to present today." And we would say to them, "Well, that's your job." But I wasn't here. But nowadays, because everyone is online and in a learning management system, you can say to them, "I don't care. You were absent. The work was there. The description of what we did in class, the homework, the prints, whatever activities, they now have access to." Although some are reverting. It's interesting. I'm getting a lot of pushback. Students are going, "I didn't check the Google Classroom." And I'm going, "You were told at the beginning of the semester every week to check." "Yeah, but I was absent." "Yeah, I know. That's not an excuse."
Exactly.
But PJ, I didn't do the work. I know.
That's the problem.
And they would go, "Don't be angry." And I go, "Oh, I'm not angry. A 0 is easy to grade. I'm quite happy, in fact."
It's the easiest one, the easiest number to give.
Yeah, I'm going, I'm good. And sit down and try to catch up. But they're going, "But I don't understand what to do." I'm going, "Well, go to the learning management system, look at the last 3 weeks of materials, ask me if you have a question." But before that, you couldn't do that. And Japan has a very strange notion, I would say strange, notion of privacy. And what that means and how that's implemented at an institutional level is quite different than other Western countries in particular. But like, for example, at two of my three schools, I wasn't allowed to have the students' email addresses, their university email addresses, before COVID. And I'm going, well, then why did they have them? Well, we don't know, but that you can't get it from the office. A student has to give it to you, and you can't ask. I was literally under a don't ask, don't tell policy for email. So at two of the schools. So what I would do is I would say, here's my email, here's my line, here's my other thing. If you want me to have these things, it's your choice. Please fill in this paper. Whereas now, I mean, all the schools have realized that's ridiculous. And we have contact with students. Some schools use Line or some other professional text messaging services. Email is available. My students, they have my Line. For those who might not listen, Line is not popular outside of East Asia, but it is the dominant texting service in Japan and several other countries as well. But we use Line. They have my email. They have the LMS usually has an internal communication structure as well. So for better or worse, better for me, worse for students, they're expected to keep up and to interact with us and each other. And in many ways, I think that's great because Japan was increasingly being left behind in the digital divide.
Yeah.
Whereas I think COVID forced Japan to step up. And where your experience with what is now standard and even public schools here have some level of integration to the net and to learning systems, remote learning systems. So
it's fascinating. There's so much mythology about Japan, right? There's so much mythology that Japan is such a high-tech place, and that's where we make all the jokes about fax machines and things like that. Because,
well, it is very high-tech, but it's
in some ways,
yeah, in research and in industry,
yeah.
Traditionally, consumer tech has been lower.
Yeah. So,
I don't know if that's true anymore.
When they show on the news in the past, when they talk about like how high-tech Japan was, they'd be showing those like at some kind of consumer show, a robot made by Honda or something. And that's what they're showing. Like, but that's not stuff that everyday people see or use, obviously. So I'm curious, you'd mentioned that some people you knew weren't able to adapt and left the profession. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was just in 2023, how competitive is it now? Are there less positions than there were at one time? You hear about the population of Japan declining so much. Is there less work? Is there less demand for people doing what you do? For those out there, and I think I know the advice you'd already give would be don't do it. But for those out there who are thinking, like you'd mentioned, someone in the States was asking you because their kid is getting a degree in TESOL or a course in TESOL. How competitive is it to get into this market now?
Well, it depends where you are. If you are in, for example, the Kansai area, which is where I live, Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto, the environs, I don't know. My English, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It is saturated. It's easy to get crap work at the university level, and there are jobs now that are paying so shockingly low. I don't know how anyone would survive on it. Decent salary jobs are very competitive, and on one hand, it isn't so as bad as we thought, because with the demographic trends trending downward, there are less and less students since maybe early 90s. I've been able to avoid that issue by only working at large universities. And it was a conscious choice of mine back when I started university work in the early 2000s, was to only work at pretty large universities. One of mine has over 30,000 students.
Oh, wow.
The other two are still multiple thousand. And what that allows is those students, as the market has shrunk, larger schools have lowered standards strategically to take in more students, so that or bought lower ranked universities incorporated them in, either keeping them separately named, but corporationally, corporately, the same structure. There's a bunch of strategies in place, but I've been quite lucky. I don't know anyone who's lost work because of the reducing numbers. My universities, particularly one in particular, has actually expanded because they literally just gobbled up small universities. That's not to say that overall there isn't an issue in the industry. There is. Numbers are down and are expected to continue downward for at least another decade. I don't know exact what the numbers are anymore. So I would say to anyone who's really determined to come teach English at the university level in Japan, think about the countryside. You had the guy.
That's what I was curious about.
Yeah, he was very interesting. And I think that's, if you are coming from overseas, in other words, if you're not already here, if you're here, you might be able to find work in the big cities. But if you are coming from abroad, they're hiring you or they haven't seen you. I mean, they've seen you online, but they haven't seen you in person. Unless you are of some level of esteem, you've published a lot, you are well known. Beyond that, then you want to head to the countryside. There are a lot of good universities out there who are trying desperately to attract talent, not just in English, but in any field. And they'll be much more open to bringing someone on, bringing them in, sponsoring their visa, getting everything, going. Whereas a university in Osaka or Tokyo going, we're not sponsoring anything. They're going, are you kidding? You get here, you walk in for the interview, you do your job. And Japanese labor law is very pro-labor after the first year. Your first year, you can be terminated for no reason whatsoever. So there's very little risk at the university level down to the eikaiwa or the language school level. They'll hire you for almost no reason and then just not keep you if you don't fit in. That's another thing. So there's two strategies if you want to work at university level. You come here, find a job, and I know people with masters and even, strangely enough, PhDs that come here and do eikaiwa or high school work while they search for university work. That is one way to do it. The other way to do it is look out into the countryside, and there is a lot of work to be had. Our mutual friend, I don't know if I should say his name, so I won't. But
I know who you're talking about, our mutual friend, the one who recently got
tenure track. He's tenure now, right?
Yeah.
But he short circuited that by leaving Osaka, going out to the countryside, taking a job that had better pay, better benefits, and better connections. That allowed him to go right into full-time contract work, which led to tenure track work, which led to his tenure. It helped. His Japanese language skills were good, and that's another thing I'd say to people: as much or more important than your credentials is your language skills. If they aren't high, it's going to be hard to find work. It is possible, but at the university level, you'd think they're more international. They're less international in terms of, because you're dealing with the HR department, probably where no English is spoken. You're not dealing, when you're hired at an eikaiwa, a conversation school, or even a high school, you may be hired by that principal or by that English head, right? Mm-hmm. In a university, you're hired by an HR department of dozens to hundreds that don't speak the language, aren't interested in speaking the language, and it's their country. They shouldn't have to. I don't mean to sound imperialist in that they should speak English. Damn it, I'm not, and I don't believe that at all. But it is harder if you're not fluent in Japanese, or at least language capable. As you know, I am not fluent, but I speak enough and I read enough that I can operate in that environment. But that is a challenge. One of my limitations to getting permanent work has been a lot of universities want a lot more Japanese. And understandably, they have a right to. I don't mean to say. I've always believed that I should be fluent in Japanese. I've been here 20 plus years and I'm not fluent. I mean, I speak it, but I'm not fluent.
Yeah.
That's a problem. But I would say to someone who's interested in university work, language skills. Make sure you have to have at least a master's. You could have a master's in almost anything.
Yeah.
If in English anyway. I mean, if you're in a field like engineering or electronics, then you need a specific master's degree. But if you are wanting to teach English at the university level, or Pandai, which is kind of like a 2-year program, university or technical school, you'll need a master's degree. Could be almost in anything. They prefer it to be either in English, in TESOL, which is teaching English, and not the same as English, as you know, or the degree of the specialty. Like a friend of mine has a master's in engineering, electrical systems engineering, and he was hired at my university, even though he teaches English, because it is a university that focuses on engineering. So they liked that, even though he's not, right now he's teaching basic core conversation classes. But so they want a master's degree minimum. They like it if you also have some kind of certification, whether that's teaching or TESOL certification or some kind of certification. Universities are much more flexible than high schools and K through 12 because the law allows them to be more flexible. So in many ways, there's it doesn't matter what you have, but have something, have a master's, have some language skill, and be creative in getting here. Sometimes it means taking a crap job, knowing that you're gonna do it for a year or 2 or 3 while you find a better one. Connections. I mean, I think that's true anywhere in the world, but especially true in Japan. Connections are king. And 2 of my 3 jobs, well, actually all 3 of my jobs came through connections. I got it not because I had a good CV, although I think my CV is okay, but they didn't care. I was recommended by people who they trusted.
That's the same. That's the way it works within the international job market too, especially when you get up the upper level, like of doing what I do. You could have an incredible CV, great experience, but it's really about knowing people, because when you know people, that's when they can circumvent a vetting process. Like when, if it's someone that they trust and that person is recommending you, if it's someone who they consider has value and they're recommending you, then that's all you need. That's how I've gotten positions in the past too. Same thing. I've known people. I made connections through social media, through conferences, through just people I worked with at other schools in the past, and now they've moved on to a different school. And I've had colleagues who've moved up through the ranks into administration from teaching positions. I knew them when they were teachers. We worked together, and and that kind of thing. So it's very important, right? Network.
Yes, I can't emphasize that enough. And the only problem, and by the way, I don't mean to critique the system, as I think it's legitimate, but it makes it hard for new people who are coming in out of country. They don't have connections necessarily. I mean, one of the benefits in your world, in the international school field, is that the connections aren't just local, right? You've got friends in that you've worked with and know you or know of you.
They're kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
In
university, it's much more local, unless you really published and done very well. That's always different. I am kind of a one-shot wonder. I mean, I've published a bunch, but only one of them was top flight journal, and that has gotten me indoors. I published that more than 10 years ago, and it still gets me people. I'll get mail out of the blue. You want to work at this university? And I'm going, wow, how do you know me? Well, you're in a top tier journal. I'm going, did you spend a few minutes and look and find that was my one shot? I am the aha of the English language publishing of Osaka. I had one or two good hits, and that's about it. By the way, I'm not talking aha. Don't send a lot of angry mail.
I like aha. I know what you mean. A one-hit wonder. Yeah.
Yeah, and I certainly feel that way.
Wow.
By the way, that's another point I didn't mention. You should have at least 2 or 3 publications, even for basic English conversation classes. That's kind of just a metric, that a minimum standard to get people in. 2 or 3 publications, could be at a in-house journal at a university. It has to be peer reviewed, but beyond that, and I've had a friend of mine, when she first started, she only had one academic publication, but she had a short story that was published, and she did some kind of how to teaching teachers how to teach, which in academia is considered a separate part of our field, but nonetheless, it was peer reviewed, and she had those, and she got the job. And she's a great teacher. I often think some of the best teachers have no qualifications whatsoever. Teaching, as you know, is an art. As well as a science, and you can have no training and be fantastic.
Absolutely.
And you can have 40 years of training and be total shite. And it happens.
Yep, and I've met all of those people.
And everyone in between.
Exactly. Wow. Well, PJ, thank you so much. I know it's getting late where you are. You got to work tomorrow.
Do you?
As well known.
Wait a minute. Are you off tomorrow?
I'm on summer holiday.
Oh, I forgot that. Yeah, but did you get all the packing done?
Well, we have a few more things to do in the apartment. The shipping company came and took all of our stuff, but there's still some more we have to do. But
by the way, I don't know if the viewers even see your pictures, although you post them. But there's this one. Kevin showed the before and after of all the rooms of his apartment, and before it's the clutter of daily life with a family. And then the after pictures, everything's been put in boxes and taped, and the floors are clean. And then you see in the background one young teenage boy over a device playing a game.
Yes.
And I got the feeling he probably didn't move during that whole cleaning.
No, he didn't. He was in that spot the whole time. The movers were just like packing all around him. He just sat there on his Nintendo Switch. Yeah.
Oh, youth. I tell you.
The youth. The youths. So where can the listeners, I'm always sharing my socials. So I put those pictures on Instagram. So you folks, if they're listening, the links are below. Go to Jayland Kev for that. Where can people find you on social media if they want to see what your slice of life in Japan looks like?
I am also on the Insta, as the young ones say. I know in the West they say IG. Is that what they say? I don't know. But in Japan we say Insta. I am on Insta. Oh, wow. It's been so long. It's funny. Kevin and I are on another podcast that he manages. And I used to always say my Insta profile. And
I still think I remember. Is it Instagram? It's Kansai _P_PEE_J JAY.
Yes, that is it, sir.
And the link will be below, folks.
The other place to find me, by the way, I would love more followers because I'm struggling at 900 something. I want to break 1,000. And you know what they say about Insta? If you're not famous, you have to have a narrowly focused profile. You just do whiskey, or just do teaching, or just do. Like you, I do slice of life kind of thing. So I put up whatever strikes my fancy. And I'm struggling at 900, and I don't know why it matters, but I really want to go over 1,000. So if anyone listening, follow me. You don't even have to look. Just follow.
Yep. Life in Osaka, Japan. That's where PJ's based. Osaka, Japan.
A lot of pictures of shrines and temples. I'm a big fan of the traditional architecture. Whiskey and beer, and the occasional university pick is up there too. And the other place you can find me is the very niche but very famous in our world Munzie Maniacs podcast with your host here. Kevin runs probably 4 or 5. He's a publishing empire, a podcast publishing empire.
Yes.
He organizes 3 or 4 different podcasts.
Yeah.
But, we do that once or twice a month. And if you like location games, give that a
I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, the Munzie Maniacs podcast. So go follow PJ on Instagram. You heard that, folks, for lots of stuff about Japan, and follow the Munzie Maniacs podcast. And it's a podcast I never talk about here. I've never even mentioned it. So go check that out as well.
I hope that wasn't a secret.
No, it's not a secret at all. It's just very different, but not a secret at all. All right, PJ. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to stop by the Just Asia podcast for the first time.
Thank you for having me, and have me back again.
Well, I want to give a huge shout out to PJ for taking the time to stop by the podcast and chat with us about working at universities in Japan. Definitely some great golden nuggets of wisdom for all of you. You can, of course, follow PJ over on Instagram. That's really the only space where he's doing things these days, over at Kansai_PEE_J. The link will be in the show notes below. Go give him a follow on Instagram, on Insta, and I know that PJ will definitely appreciate it. And I just want to let you guys know that I really appreciate having you guys listen to the podcast. It's been really great bringing this back to life. So it's been a long time. And again, like I've mentioned before in the last episode when I chatted with Tony, I can't believe how many folks are still hanging around, but you can also help the podcast grow. It's not like it once was. Back in 2014, when I did talk to PJ for episode number 27, there really weren't any Japan podcasts in those days. So many people came flocking to the Just Japan podcast. Now, of course, there's a lot of other fantastic content out there, a lot of other great shows you can listen to. So I'd appreciate it if you could help us grow again and share this podcast with the people you know who are interested in the topic. Now, of course, it would be fantastic also if you could leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast. Leave us a rating as well. If it's on Spotify, if it's on Amazon Podcast or Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, all those places. You can follow me on social media, of course. I'm pretty active on X at Mad for Maple. I'm on Blue Sky at Jayland Kev. There's a Facebook page for this podcast. The link will be in the show notes. Come on over. I post there usually pretty much every day. I post photos of Japan, different videos, a lot of interesting content. So go over there and like the Facebook page. It is, you can also find it at facebook.com/justjapanstuff. And and also guess what? I'm very late to this game, but I did start a TikTok at Busan Kevin 2. Those of you who know me from my YouTube days as Busan Kevin, and I still do share a lot of shorts these days on YouTube at Busan Kevin, and of course now I'm doing TikToks again. Pretty late to the game, but it's still fun. It's motivation for me to create more content, and often I do some cross pollination. So I make a video, I share it on TikTok, I also share it on YouTube Shorts, and sometimes on Instagram as well. So all those links, all those social media places I'm active, go check the links below in the show notes, and you'll find me there. Go follow me in those places. All right, well, that's it for another episode of the Just Japan podcast. It'll be the last episode for the month of January. Right now, I'm kind of aiming at about 3 episodes per month. February coming up, we've got the Chinese New Year holiday. Chinese New Year is a big thing in many parts of Asia, around the world. I'm no longer in China, but I'm here in Malaysia at the moment, and it is still a very big holiday. I'll have 9 days off. I'm not complaining. So there will be an episode, of course, coming in the first week of February. But that's it for this week, the Just Japan podcast, episode number 209. Thank you so much, guys, for being awesome. And as I always used to say, no matter where you are in the world, I hope you're happy, I hope you're healthy, and I'll be talking to you real soon.